I'm Sally O'Driscoll from Resisting Project 2025, and I'm here today with Maria Foscarinis. She is the founder of the National Homelessness Law Center, and the author of And Housing for All, The Fight to End Homelessness in America, which was just published in June of this year. And that's among many other publications. She has launched and led numerous legislative and policy campaigns to end homelessness and has pursued litigation to enforce and protect the rights of unhoused people. She's been named a human rights hero by the American Bar Association. Foscarinis is also the recipient of the Catherine and George Alexander Law Prize from Santa Clara University School of Law, the John Macy Award from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, the Public Interest Law Award from the Public Interest Foundation at Columbia Law School, and a Rockefeller Foundation residency in Bellagio, Italy, among many other honors. She's currently an adjunct professor at Columbia Law School. Maria Foscarinis has 40 years of intense experience in understanding homelessness and revealing its complex causes and why it's become an increasing crisis since the 1980s when Reagan started cutting social programs. And we're talking to her now just as homelessness has rapidly become an even more fraught and nationally visible issue than it was before, because the Trump administration recently took over the policing of Washington, D.C., and immediately targeted the homeless as a justification for invoking emergency powers that the president said allowed him to send in the National Guard and federal agents. He claimed that the city has been taken over by violent gangs, criminals, and homeless encampments. Trump wrote on his social media site that homeless people will have to leave immediately. Quote, "We'll give you places to stay, but far from the capital. It is not yet clear where those places are." Amber Harding, executive director of the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless, described the mayhem that took place as the removals of homeless people began in DC and police destroyed encampments in Washington Circle. Trump Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt stated that homeless individuals will be given the option to leave their encampment, to be taken to a homeless shelter, to be offered addiction or mental health services. But as Harding pointed out, the federal government has provided no new resources at all to find that shelter or help for those whose belongings were destroyed. So Maria, thank you so much for joining us. And before we start our conversation, I want to read two short quotes from your book. "Homelessness is not a disease, nor is it an accident. It's the result of deliberate policy choices made by people. We can make different ones." And another short quote, "Homelessness is a man-made disaster." And that, I think, is what we're hoping that you will explain to us. So even though the situation in Washington, D.C. is only the most visible one at the moment, it's a problem that we see in cities, in suburbs, in rural areas all over America. So the first question is, could you tell us briefly how the housing crisis got this bad and what the policies are that are causing the surge in the population of unhoused people?
Sure. Well, Sally, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you. As you alluded to, this crisis has a long history, and it really started in the early 1980s. Homelessness at the scale we see it today has not always been a crisis in our country. It really began in the early 80s, and what triggered it was massive cuts to social safety net programs by the Reagan administration. Now, Ronald Reagan came into office on a campaign promise to shrink the federal government. And he did exactly that. And he did it primarily by targeting programs for poor people. Among those was housing programs, which had been in place since the New Deal and which had provided hundreds of thousands of units of housing affordable to poor people each year. And those were slashed So they went from funding over 300,000 new units per year in the late 1970s, 1979, to less than 3,000 in 1982 per year. So this was a huge, huge cut, and it had consequences. It created an enormous gap in need for affordable housing among poor people and the availability of that housing and government resources to provide it. That created a gap that has still not been filled. Over the subsequent years, some of that funding for housing programs increased, but it never came back to where it had been. And today, as of now, only 1 in 4 of people who are poor enough to qualify for housing assistance actually receives it. That number might get much larger, or the disparity might get much larger if cuts proposed now by the Trump administration are actually enacted. But only 1 in 4 as of now of those poor enough to be eligible actually receives that assistance. So in the meantime, what happens to the 3 out of 4 who don't receive it? They struggle. Increasing numbers of Americans pay large proportions of their incomes on rent. This is the driving cause of homelessness. This is how it began. This is why it continues. And this is what drives increases. I guess I can add to that. I talked about government programs, but there's also the private market, which at the same time government programs have shrunk, the private market has become increasingly distorted. So the cuts are one thing, but the deregulation of private market has been a parallel phenomenon that has increased progressively over the years. So right now, housing is being constructed. It's not that it's not being built, it is being built, but what is being built are luxury units, not affordable housing. So we have housing getting increasingly expensive, private market housing increasingly expensive, so that not only poor people, but middle income people as well are being squeezed and paying larger and larger proportions of their incomes for housing. And so that has also been a parallel trend that has been getting worse.
So that's the overarching problem, which you discuss at length in your book. You also mentioned some potential things that can at least ease the problem of homelessness, some remedies such as having the right to a lawyer if your landlord tries to evict you, the things to stop the things that push people into homelessness. Can you talk a little bit more about those?
Sure. So preventing homelessness is key, and having a right to a lawyer in eviction court is one of those critical potential remedies. And there's been a move underway across the country, started in New York City, 2017. New York became the first city in the country to enact a right to counsel law, so that if you can't afford a lawyer and you're in housing court facing eviction, you can have a lawyer for free appointed to represent you. And this launched a movement that has spread across the country. So a number of cities, over 17, some states have such laws. This is very important because before this, studies showed that the vast majority of landlords in eviction court are represented by lawyers, and only a tiny fraction of tenants are. And so there's a huge power imbalance, and that leads to tenants having being essentially defenseless, literally, in court, and having little chance of holding on to their housing. And studies also showed that tenants who were represented by lawyers stood a much better chance of staying housed and avoiding homelessness. And that this also could save money because by avoiding homelessness, they avoided shelter and all the costs that come with homelessness, which are very significant. There is a caveat, though, to this. This is something that while it's called a right to counsel, is not truly a right in the sense that it's not funded as a right. So in New York, for example, the lawyers who are provided are by and large legal aid lawyers, and they are not who are supposed to be publicly funded, but the funding is not there and has not been put in place to fund the number of lawyers that are needed. So poor tenants are still going to housing court unrepresented. And so it's a program that is very promising, but it's not funded to meet its promise. And this is true across the country. So it's a wonderful concept and a very important one, but it has not to date been funded in the way it needs to be to actually do what it's meant to do.
So you just mentioned the costs associated with homelessness. After all, throwing people into homelessness is not actually cost effective for governments. But can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. So this is very important. It is not cost effective for governments. Homelessness is costly, obviously for the people affected, but also for government, for all of us. It means that so shelter can be very expensive compared to housing, but also homelessness has other costs. For example, people who are homeless often don't have health insurance. They go to emergency rooms when they have health emergencies or need health care. Without health insurance, they can't regularly see doctors and use emergency rooms as their treatment option out of necessity. That's very expensive. People who are homeless and also unsheltered, who are living in public places, are subject to laws that criminalize their presence. This is expensive. Cities that carry out sweeps, for example, or even, just enforce laws prohibiting people from being in public, deploy the resources of their police departments, their prosecutors' offices, their court systems, the entire criminal justice mechanism, and that is expensive. When you add these costs up, it turns out that actually housing people is typically less expensive than allowing people to remain in homelessness.
So this is the crux of the problem right now, I think, that as you describe it in your book. The phrase that you use is housing or handcuffs, which is referring to the criminalization of homelessness, which you trace back to the early modern period, the switch from feudalism to the beginnings of capitalism in Europe, with anti-vagrancy laws and controlling of the working population.
Right.
And yet here we see the demonization of the homeless. And so,
Yes.
in her remarks in that press conference, Caroline Levitt said there are laws in place to stop this. So can you describe for people who don't know that much about it, what kinds of laws are governing the public space that homeless people are forced to use to live in?
Right. So when I say criminalization of homelessness, I'm referring to the current version of laws that have a long history, as you mentioned. Earlier, decades ago, the focus was on vagrancy laws. Um, we can trace this back to feudal times, as you mentioned, but in our current sort of modern period of mass homelessness, the laws that are used are kind of descendants of vagrancy laws, and they're a little more narrowly tailored to target people who are homeless. So They can be laws that prohibit or make it a crime to sleep in public, to sit in public places, to lie down in public places, to camp. Camp is a popular way of phrasing this, by which governments mean sleep with a blanket or a tent or anything to cover, or a cardboard box. So laws that govern the use of public space by people who are homeless. There are also another type of criminalization is laws that prohibit asking others for help in public, anti-begging laws, often called panhandling or sometimes aggressive panhandling. And there are many different variants on all of this. But basically, it refers to laws that police and make criminal the presence of homeless people in public spaces, living in public spaces, and everything that that involves. It's a trend that has been rising since the early 1990s in this most recent variation. And it's become, I consider that this is the primary, the primary response at the local level to homelessness by governments. It's making it a crime, enacting laws that push people. The goal is to push people out of sight, to banish them from city limits.
And yet there's nowhere else to go.
Yes.
Those laws can cover anywhere, and those are the sweeps that we're seeing in DC at the moment. The sweeping away of, which is an interesting word, sweeping away of homeless encampments
Right.
to make the people who lived in them invisible. And of course, that action also destroys all kinds of things that people need in order to, for
Right.
example, get benefits. They may, in such a sweep, they may lose their ID. They may lose, and of course, they don't have an address. So finding, even if they're eligible for benefits, that's going to make them move further into homelessness rather than bring them out of it.
Right. It makes homelessness much worse. Of course, it makes the lives of homeless people that much more miserable if they're constantly under threat, constantly having to move, constantly being woken up in order to move, not being able to sleep. I mean, it makes their lives miserable, but it also makes it much harder for them to get out of homelessness because, as you say, they lose critical documents, critical possessions, IDs. They may also acquire an arrest record or a criminal conviction, which makes it much harder to then get housing or get a job or even sometimes to get into shelter. So it just makes everything much worse. And yet this is a policy. These are policies that are being pursued all across the country, primarily starting at the city level, but also now spreading quickly to states and obviously the federal government. It's not just the action, the crackdown in the District of Columbia that the Trump administration is pursuing. There's also an executive order that was issued um, some time ago that adopts this as a goal and a policy. This is something coming from Project 2025 that says that encampments will be swept away, and also that funds that have been designated for housing will be cut and put into emergency shelter and so-called treatment programs. So this is part of a larger playbook for the Trump administration.
Right. And we're talking about the demonization and criminalization of the homeless, but who are the unhoused at the moment? What kind of people are we talking about? Because I think it's important for us to realize that it's not just addicts or people with mental health issues. It's all kinds of people. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, there's all kinds of people. Some people, there are a lot of families, there are people who work and are homeless. About half the population works in some way, either full-time, part-time, don't earn enough to pay for housing. Um, s- s- um, the about 20 to 30% suffer from either mental health issues or substance abuse problems. Um, Certainly not the majority, which is what Trump is saying. But I think it's also important for us to recognize that many Americans suffer from mental health issues and substance abuse issues and are not, you know, but they have a place to live. If you have problems like that and you're on the street, those also become much worse. And they can be a result of homelessness or can certainly be exacerbated by homelessness. Um, Children and youth are homeless. It's a range. The one important thing to note is that the racial disproportionality, the percentage of homeless people who are Black is way higher to compared to their representation in the general population. So some 40% of the homeless population is Black versus 12% in um, the poverty population and 11% in the overall population. So it's a way larger representation, and that can be traced back to the legacy of segregation in housing and discrimination more broadly, how much harder it is, and how there are deliberate policies that intentionally keep people who are Black, especially, and generally who are of non white races, primarily Black people, out of housing and jobs and all sorts of opportunities. So that's another piece of who homeless people are. I think it's important to recognize, you know, how people become homeless. They typically it starts with an eviction. Someone has a home, loses that home, starts by moving in with friends or family. Often, friends and family are also poor and are not able to accommodate their family member for the long term. This is part of what I think sociologists call network poverty, social network poverty. That, you know, if you're poor, you don't have the not only do you not have the resources, but your network doesn't either. So people will move in with friends and family. That will work for a little bit, but can't be sustained, and then eventually will not be able to get out of their, you know, getting new housing is expensive. You typically have to have first month's rent, security deposit. You have to have saved up a sum of money to get new housing, and that's very difficult. Um, so it's hard to get out once you are made homeless, once you become homeless. Um, the demonization is a very important point, and that also has its own history, which started, um, at least for this modern period, started with the Reagan administration. Reagan demonized social programs, um, saying famously the scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. So he demonized government programs, creating a climate that allowed him to then slash them, but also said about homelessness, about homeless people, that they are homeless by choice. And you know, that is something that has stuck and has been embraced, and it's not been limited to Republicans. Bill Clinton added to this sort of narrative through his campaign to end welfare as we know it, and his, you know, the metaphor of the welfare. Well, I guess the welfare queen started with Reagan, but Bill Clinton continued that. And so there's been this demonization, but also this sort of more insidious narrative that people are homeless because they choose to be. that there is help available, but they're just not availing themselves of it, that they like to be living on the street. This is a lifestyle choice. Those are Reagan's words. So this is a very destructive narrative that makes it more challenging to put solutions in place.
And of course, as you say, if half the people who are homeless are working, the problem is also that the minimum wage is not sufficient in any way
Right,
which,
right.
to sustain either an individual or a family.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there are two sides to these are two sides of the same coin. No housing is affordable if your wages are inadequate. So, yes, the minimum wage has not been increased since 2009. It is not at all adequate to sustain a family. And you can think of the gap as a gap in affordable housing or failure of wages to afford housing, to be sufficient to afford housing.
Now, you mentioned earlier the Trump administration is following the Project 2025 outline for the way its policies are going to deal with homelessness. And of course, the Project 2025 is only the most recent iteration of the Heritage Foundation's mandates for leadership that began with Reagan. So it's not a surprise that they continue the same destructive narratives. But we also just saw in the One Big Beautiful Bill the major cuts to Medicaid, which are also going to add another piece to this. The gutting of mental health services, among other things, and the gutting of public housing. So you have talked in your book about policies that could end homelessness. And I'm just going to quote from your book again. Permanent solutions to homelessness must address its fundamental causes, the shortage of affordable housing, inadequate income to meet basic needs, the lack of social services, and political disenfranchisement. Because, of course, as you also say, the homeless don't vote, not because they don't want to, but because they can't register to vote. So obviously, I'm not going to ask you to explain exactly fully what the solutions to homelessness might be, but could you address that a little bit further?
Right. So, yes, I focus a lot on housing as the driving cause, but of course, there's more to it than just housing. There's income, as we said, in terms of inadequate wages or benefit levels for people who are unable to work and rely on social safety net programs. Those benefits are grossly inadequate. For example, people who are disabled and rely on Social Security supplemental security income, which is a program of the Social Security Act for disabled people, disability benefits. Those are grossly inadequate. They're not adequate even to pay for a room. They have not been updated for years. So income, both earned income and benefit, income from social benefits, both are inadequate to meet basic needs to pay for housing. Social services, by that I mean healthcare and mental health care, those are not available. The cuts to Medicaid will make that worse. But even without those cuts, people who are seeking mental health care, who are seeking substance abuse treatment services, are not able to obtain them because their services are so overwhelmed. They're not sufficient. Political disenfranchisement is also critical. People who are homeless, in theory, could register to vote. I mean, there has been case law on this. There have been legislative efforts to address this. In theory, if you are living, you can put down a park bench, if that's where you're living, as your address and register to vote, but only a minuscule number of people have the wherewithal or even know to do this, and only a fraction of local, voting places know that they could accept this or have laws in place that allow them to do that. So, for all practical purposes, voting is out of reach for people who are homeless. Only something like 10% of people who are homeless actually vote. So, that, you know, and then there are other kind of what I collectively call civil rights issues, like apart from criminalization, which is an egregious violation of people's civil rights. There are other ways in which people who are unhoused are discriminated against. Um, People are not able, and this is not unique to unhoused people, but people often who are somehow able to obtain a housing voucher and try to use it are turned away if they have it based on source of income discrimination is what this is called. Um, so there are a lot of different issues that need to be addressed to truly um, address the causes of homelessness. Housing is the key issue, but our social safety net is really in tatters, and that whole social safety net needs to be in place to really address all of the issues that people who are unhoused face. I view homelessness as an aspect of poverty. It's an extreme form of poverty. So it's not something unique or separate. It's an extreme form of larger issues, systemic issues, issues that are also derived from inequality, which has only gotten worse. And um, so a whole panoply of issues needs to be addressed. Countries that have successfully addressed homelessness, like, for example, Finland, have a right to housing. Finland has a right to housing in its constitution, and it implements that right through a program of funding for what they call social housing, which is affordable housing, essentially, that is subsidized by government. But they also fund income supports for people and childcare and healthcare and a whole series of social services that people need. So that's there's a range of different issues that have to be addressed.
In your book, which, by the way, is full of extremely moving stories that help the reader to understand exactly how homelessness happens, how difficult it is to get out, from all of the years that you have spent working directly with the unhoused population. But what you seem to be suggesting is that we reframe the narrative away from demonization and criminalization toward the understanding of housing as a human right, and that is necessary to bring all of the other social services into line with that. At Resisting Project 2025, we are always interested in how one resists and changes bad policy. You talk in your book about the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign. Could you talk about that and other things that you think people can do as they come to understand the meaning of homelessness in this country?
Sure. So the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign is a campaign that the organization I founded and others launched almost 10 years ago as a way to marry the fight against criminalization with a fight for housing as a human right. So that we're not just fighting against bad things, we're not just fighting against laws that criminalize people who are homeless, but we're also fighting affirmatively for housing as a human right. And this campaign has become increasingly robust as more and more communities around the country have joined it. And it's become even more urgently needed as the crackdown on homeless people has increased. I should add, it's increased dramatically since a Supreme Court decision a year ago, last June, that really opened the door to communities to criminalize homeless people by removing a key legal argument that had been succeeding in striking down such laws. So the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign has its own website, housingnothandcuffs.org. People can go to that website, sign up to endorse the campaign, which means endorsing a set of principles that say, you know, people should be housed, not criminalized, and a few more things. It's fairly straightforward. But then you get updates on what's going on, and there are fights going on around the country. So that's one way people can get involved. There are other ways, which are, if you're living in a community that has such laws, you can write to members of your city council, you can go to city council hearings, you can argue against such laws, you can protest such laws. They're also at the state level, and you can do that at the state level. At the federal level, there are a lot of activities against protesting the Trump administration. And in DC right now, there are regular rallies, I think, under the name Free DC to protest the current extreme policies. So there are ways to protest. And, for DC right now, it's especially important for people who are not in DC to write to their members of Congress, because DC doesn't have a vote, it's not represented in Congress. So writing to members of Congress about what is happening there is very valuable and important. Those are some ways. People can also, of course, volunteer directly to help people who are homeless, and a lot of people do volunteer to serve food or distribute food or help operate shelters, and those are all valuable things and a way to get closer to people and to understand the issue more. But in my view, the most important thing is to be an advocate, a political advocate, and use your voice in the political process to advocate for solutions. There are some bills pending now in Congress, the Housing Not Handcuffs Act, that is legislation against criminalization, and so supporting that. The likelihood of its moving now is not great, but it's still important to support and to show support for those who are promoting this kind of legislation. There is, in less grim news, there is quite a bit of activism at the local level that is having success. And I mentioned some of this in my book. I mentioned in particular an effort in Seattle, in Washington State, by a group called House Our Neighbors, which has been very successful over the past few years in creating at the local level a social housing program and a mechanism to fund that program. So they created a social housing agency within the city whose mission is to fund and support social housing, meaning housing that's affordable to a range of income levels, including extremely low income people and unhoused people. And now they've just, through a referendum, passed an initiative to fund this program. And the interesting thing, they had a massive public education campaign, community engagement campaign, and got over, let's see, just almost, I think 67% or just, yeah, 67% of the vote in favor of this initiative. So that's very encouraging that, the local level, there is progress and there are opportunities and there are opportunities for engagement.
And we'll provide links for all of the things that you've mentioned to make it easier for people to find them.
Great.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think is important to say?
Yes. So I should mention, I would be remiss not to mention the Housing First program. So Housing First is a way of operationalizing housing, not the right to housing. I mean, it could be a way to operationalize a human right to housing approach, but it's a program that has been found to be very effective in ending homelessness. And it's a programmatic approach. It's a program that says you provide housing to people first, and then you offer whatever services they might also need. Like, for example, if they need mental health treatment or substance abuse treatment or job training or whatever they need, you provide the housing first and then whatever services are needed next. Because the idea is without a stable place to live, these services are unlikely to be effective and really help end that person's homelessness. So this has been very effective, but it's been massively underfunded. It's a program that has been proven to work, but it has not ever been funded to scale. So only a fraction of people who need it, who could benefit from it, actually are able to participate. Project 2025 calls for eliminating that program and taking away its funding. And so that's part of the demonization of programs. It's part of the current effort to undermine programs that do work. And, the argument, part of the argument is, well, Housing First has not ended homelessness, therefore it must not work. But the reality is it's never been funded at the scale that it has needed to be funded. And so, of course, it has not ended homelessness.
And of course, putting the money into law enforcement and militarization rather than in social programs such as Housing First has other benefits for the administration, I think, at this point.
Right.
Uh,
So that's it. That's all I wanted to add.
We've been talking with Maria Foscarinis, most recently the author of And Housing for All, The Fight to End Homelessness in America. And I think that you've given us a wonderful overview of the causes and possible solutions for this man-made crisis. And I would like to end once again with your quotation, which says it all. Homelessness is not a disease, because after all, thinking about homelessness, it really is a change of perspective, not just a change of political policy. Homelessness is not a disease, nor is it an accident. It's the result of deliberate policy choices made by people, and we can make different ones. And I want to thank you very, very much, both for your four decades of advocacy and for talking to us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for highlighting this important issue. It's a pleasure.